Lepo pozdravljeni danes iz dislocirane enote studia Megafon. Javljam se vam v tednu, ki je ravno minil po tednu, ko se je v Ljubljani odvil festival migrantskega filma. In v sklopu preddogodkov se je na Akademiji za gledališče, radio, film in televizijo v Ljubljani oglasil tudi palestinski poznavalec mednarodnih odnosov, ki je spregovoril o stanju v Palestini. Gledali smo namreč 3 kratke filme palestinskega režiserja, ki je trenutno v begunskem taborišču v Libanonu. No, o tem kaj več v drugi polovici oddaje, bomo pa na kratko tudi pogledali, kaj bo moč videti na festivalu AGRFT, ki se je pričel včeraj. In kot ste lahko slišali, že zadnjič ima letos precej opolnomočeno filmsko prezenco. No, kaj več o tem tudi malce kasneje. Najprej namreč par besed o trenutno najbolj aktualni aferi na področju slovenskega filma. O njegovi podhranjenosti v finančnem smislu seveda govorimo ves čas, ko govorimo o slovenskem filmu, no tokrat pa se je zgodilo nekaj drugega. Napovedi Ministrstva za kulturo so sicer trenutno izjemno optimistične, saj naj bi se proračun v prihodnjem letu še povečal. Za koliko ne vemo sicer še točno, vsaj kar se tiče področja filma, ampak nadejamo se, da bo vsako od področij prejelo določeno povišanje. No, kaj pa se je zdaj pravzaprav zgodilo? Torej, na Slovenskem filmskem centru so v letu 2022 že pravzaprav podprli film na podlagi razpisa seveda, ki pa naj bi se ukvarjal z nogometnim klubom Svoboda in tudi, tak je delovni naslov za enkrat. Namenili pa so mu na podlagi razpisa menda 280.000 evrov. Film bi moral biti letos že v sklepni fazi realizacije, ampak ima zavod, ki film producira, letos že drugič blokiran račun, transakcijski račun seveda. No, film naj bi režiral Boris Petković, ki o tem ni vedel ničesar. Na razpis pa je film prijavil Iridium film, ki je do nedavnega imel 2 zaposlena. No, Slovenski filmski center naj bi po poročanju Dela že aprila povpraševal po domnevnih nepravilnostih v zvezi z izvedbo projekta, se sestal tako z režiserjem kot tudi producentom Bojanom Mastilovićem, a uradno revizijo do danes menda ni sprožil, takšni so bili podatki v preteklem tednu. No, do danes menda se je nekaj že spremenilo. Filmski center pa vseeno zaenkrat trdi, da, citiram, ne razpolaga z dokazi, da so bila sredstva nenamensko porabljena in da je projekt še v teku, torej pogodba še veljavna. Takšni so zadnji podatki. Konec citata seveda. Prihodnji teden naj bi vseeno stekla torej vmesna revizija projekta, za katero so se odločili ta teden, saj se zaenkrat sluti, da je 168.000 evrov izpuhtelo neznano kam. No, po podatkih Dela naj bi bilo namensko porabljenih od skupno 560.000 evrov, le okoli 50.000 evrov sredstev. In baje, da se je za realizacijo projekta čakalo še sofinanciranje hrvaškega in grškega filmskega centra, ki pa sta eden že junija povedala, da tega projekta pač ne bosta podprla, tako da zdaj ne rabijo več ničesar čakati. No, od ustanovitve agencije leta 2010 naj takšnih primerov, da bi torej morali uporabiti pravna sredstva zoper producente, ne bi bilo, ampak menda producenti za zaprositev izplačila druge tranše pri projektih financiranih z zneskom višjim od 100.000 evrov sploh niso dolžni predložiti obračunske dokumentacije. To menda delajo le mali projekti, veliki pa oddajajo le stroškovnik. No, Slovenski filmski center napoveduje, da bo odslej izvajal delne revizije vseh projektov, ki so že prejeli izplačana sredstva in si želijo prestaviti termin snemanja. Takšnih je trenutno 5 projektov, no drugi ukrep, ki pa so ga, potem ko je prišel ven ta članek na Delu, se odločili po novem uvesti. Drugi ukrep je torej ta, da se producentom, ki kot glavni producenti delajo prvi celovečerni film, že na začetku dodeli producenta mentorja oziroma nadzornika, ki bo projekt za financerja spremljal in s tem imel možnost vpogleda v dokumentacijo. Zdaj, kdo bo plačal stroške za tega producenta mentorja, seveda ni znano. Najverjetneje bodo morali plačati sami, seveda iz razpisnih sredstev. Je pa postalo vmes znano med drugim to, da režiser Petković, ki je z ekipo že intenzivno se pripravljal na snemanje, menda o tej situaciji dejansko ni vedel ničesar. Vse skupaj je torej postalo ena velika godlja in upamo lahko, da ne gre za še eno od domačih korupcijskih afer leta. No, ta vsaj z področja filma. Film naj bi sicer po novem, ko so mu prestavili datum, dokončali do novembra leta 2026. No, vsekakor upam, da to ne bo nova realnost tistih, ki so na pot poklicnega filmskega ustvarjanja zdaj šele stopili, torej študentov AGRFT, na primer, Akademije za gledališče, radio, film in televizijo, ki so včeraj pričeli z že omenjenim festivalom AGRFT, na katerem bo videti kar nekaj filmov. Mimogrede, če želite kaj podrobneje izvedeti o festivalu, poglejte prejšnjo in akcijo na našem YouTube kanalu, kajti tam sem spregovorila z vodjo filmskega programa Miranom Zupaničem, sicer prodekanom AGRFT-ja. No, včeraj smo že lahko videli filme od študentov iz Lodža in pa dokumentarne filme z AGRFT, danes pa filme iz Cetinja in televizijske drame.
Mir ni več opcija. Ni več opcija. Ni več opcija. Ni več opcija.
Študentski filmi so praviloma kratki, vse tja do 6. oktobra pa si bomo lahko ogledali skupno 12 projekcij, tokrat tudi med vikendom.
Ja sam čovjek koji improvizira situaciju u maniri raspoloženja.
I oni su ljudi, samo ljudi, koji vi.
Vem, preveč sem povzdignil glas, ampak ko sem ob vas, se ne znam brzdati.
Ja, tudi jaz se težko brzdam.
U redu.
Ti mene ne slišiš. Enkrat ne nehaš.
Veš kaj, jaz mislim, da to te vleče, to te potegne.
Obrnimo se še k manj radostnim tematikam. Danes, ko Izrael bombardira že 4 okoliške države v samooklicani samoobrambi, napadi na Palestino trajajo nekaj manj kot 1 leto. Okupacija ozemelj, na katerih so živeli, pa traja veliko dlje. Na prvem preddogodku Festivala migrantskega filma se je v Ljubljani na AGRFT ustavil Majdom Nasrallahom, človekoljub in poznavalec situacije v Palestini, pa tudi strokovnjak za mednarodno pravo. Tudi sam Palestinec, ki pa sicer ima izraelsko državljanstvo, več bo povedal seveda sam v posnetku. No, 3 kratki filmi, ki smo jih gledali, sicer niso bili njegovi, ampak filmi režiserja Mahdija Fleifla, ki pa si potovanja iz begunskega taborišča v Libanonu trenutno ni mogel privoščiti, bomo rekli, zaradi seveda očitnih razmer. No, ta palestinski begunec, torej kot rečeno, živi v begunskem taborišču oziroma vsaj tako upamo.
Director and the maker of the films that we saw. I don't know how much you know about him, but he was born in Dubai, but raised in the Lebanese refugee Palestinian camps. And he then moved to Denmark And he studied film at the Film Academy later on in Great Britain, where he also then set up the production company Nagba Film Works. And he has actually received quite a few rewards already. He received the Silver Bear for A Man Returned that we saw, that was filmed in 2016. And his latest film, just let me check, To a Land Unknown, has been this year premiered in Cannes. He has also made another film, which is also quite interesting. At least for me, I signed a petition which also talks about the boycott, divestment, sanction movement and somehow repercussions that he felt coming from his friends after he signed a petition calling for the BDS. And he says that he makes films somehow to hold on to the forgotten, to mark what shouldn't be erased from collective memory. But I guess he's also very raw and very much somehow uses and starts from the fact that he's on the ground, he knows the people. Reda, who we have followed through all 3 films, he has known him, as it said in the film, for 20 years now, so since Reda was 10 years old, and he's a neighbor of his grandfather, of the director's grandfather.
V vseh 3 filmih, ki smo si jih ogledali na AGRFT-ju, smo torej lahko spremljali Redo, ki se sprva poda na migrantsko pot v Grčijo, kjer se nekako zatakne zaradi povsod zaprtih vrat, potem zapade v odvisnost zaradi heroina, skupaj s svojimi ostalimi prijatelji, ki so se podali na pot, se nato vrne, se doma poroči, postane prekupčevalec mamil, postane seveda še naprej odvisen od tega in nato v 3. filmu, črno-belem, najbolj tragičnem, v bistvu razlaga, kako se želi vrniti se v Grčijo, kljub temu, da mu prej ni uspelo iti naprej in kako še vedno se ni uspel rešiti tega, kot sam pravi, prekletstva. Ne? Ve, da je nekaj narobe z njim, ve, da drugače ne more živeti, ampak sam pravi, kaj pa naj naredim, saj sem vendar preklet. No, najnovejšega filma Mahdija Fleifla sicer tokrat nismo gledali, kajti tisti je celovečerni, mi smo gledali 3 kratki, ta celovečerni iz letošnjega leta pa je bil že predvajan na festivalu v Cannesu. In poglejmo, za kateri film gre.
ليك تقول بفانتر على كل أثينا
كسخت أثينا
حنروح على ألمانيا
تعرف
مش عارف مع مين واقع استنى يصيبك
الفلسطينية
احنا
شتلة حربوق قعدش معهم
يعني بالنسبة لجواز سفرك وجواز سفره بدنا نزيد عليهم 500 يورو.
خاوي ولا ما أكيد خابن
حبيبي وين اختفيت؟ قلقتني عليك.
آسف والله حياتي.
طلعين من هون لو بدها تطبق السما على الأرض.
الشعر يقول سقط القناع عن القناع لا إخوة لك يا أخي لا أصدقاء يا صديقي ولا قلاع سقط القناع.
Tudi pravkar videni novi film Mahdija Fleifla se ukvarja s problematiko migrantstva, predvsem pa z vzroki za migracije, torej situacijo v njegovi domovini, Palestini, kolikor jo je sploh še ostalo. Zakaj se je odločil, da to predstavi v svojih filmih, pa je razložil Majdom Nasrallahom.
Mostly to portray... Oh, like this. All right, sorry. You know, in the struggle for Palestinian freedom, the use of art as a medium is usually geared towards portraying the realities of oppression by your direct oppressor, right? It's always been used as a tool to humanize ourselves and to try to portray the experience of Palestinians, whether it's in the visual arts or performance arts or music, etc. And it's always so blatantly trying to project the reality of oppression wherever it might be. And then, you know, I'm sitting and I'm watching this film, and it's not directly like that, right? So it's not this kind of in your face, see our humanity, but rather this more, this more kind of subtle experience. And as a matter of fact, it's actually way more, I wouldn't say intriguing, but it's very catching to me because, you know, usually when we talk about half of the Palestinian population, which is 7 million Palestinians in exile, we tend to clump them all together, you know, as if it was one big collective that's outside. And we seem to forget that there's actually these micro realities, micro environments created by the same systems. And it was actually pretty, and one of the first things that also jump in your face is classist issues, right? And if you try to dismantle it, right? I think one of the major things that jumps in your face in these films is this paradoxical parallel of either resistance or criminality, right? So as a Palestinian, you're kind of placed in this position where you're expected to somehow to be not an ambassador, but a manifestation of a struggle, an actor, a constant actor of being a resistance fighter, of being someone that pushes back, and so on and so forth. And if it's not, it's the other, it's criminality. And those are situations and settings created by poverty, right? Which brings us to the most important factor, which is this feeling of alienation and estrangement that all Palestinians feel, right? You have to, you know, one of them was very, very evident was this going back, right? So it's just, you know, this estrangement in Europe where you're trying to find a living, but it's also this going back to a place where you also feel estranged, right? And it's this struggle to exist in places where you're not welcome, and going to places where you don't feel like you can ever find home. And it's, you know, it's very hard to try to describe this reality as a lived experience, really. And as a Palestinian, you look, and I've never been exposed to the realities of young men that come to Europe and they try to survive here, right? And so in this sense, I think what it really boils down to is this engineered and framework in which Palestinians can exist, which, you know, and if you look at the United States right now, you're the troublemaker for standing up for, you know, freedom of expression or freedom. So you're always portrayed, you're always projected as not just an outsider, but a troublemaker. But there's nowhere else for you to go, and that, you know, it simplifies it when it's just like, yeah, take us home, take us back to Palestine, right? And so these are some of the juxtapositions, but it's also becoming more and more prevalent, this culture of crime, right? Not only do we see it in refugee camps, but we also see it, you know, across the Arab world at large. And it's this attempt by, you know, major political actors to neutralize and to subvert the young generations of people that might potentially be big forces in the liberation struggle, right? And so it's, you know, it might seem too basic, but that is precisely it, right? It's this, you're not welcome, but you can't go home.
Ja, filmi so pogosto odlična vstopna točka za razumevanje situacije določenega družbenega prostora, pa tudi časa, lokacije in pa vrenja oziroma stanja, v kateri se družba nahaja. Čeprav lahko po eni strani filmi prikažejo dogajanje le z enega zornega kota, to ni nujno enostransko, kaj šele enoplastno, pa naj bo to namerno ali nenamerno. No, Fleiflove kratke filme o redi sicer res lahko gledamo kot klasične observacijske dokumentarce o nekem človeku, ki je zašel, propadel, Lahko pa se vprašamo, kako je prišlo do tega in zakaj je začel propadati. Zakaj mu je življenje v zaporu na prostem oziroma v taborišču nekaj vsakdanjega?
But I think it's very important to begin with the fact that, you know, when we attempt to analyze or observe the actions and the policies of Israel, the launching point is there's a normal state that is somehow enacting some kind of institutionalized oppression that can somehow be amended or, you know, if addressed. But, you know, that really shifts the focus away from the core issue here, which is fascist ideology, right? Which is Zionism. Zionism as a political ideology is something that began way before 1948, you know, and when we approach it through this lens, when we attempt to see the struggle for Palestine as one against an ideology of supremacy, then the whole framework, the paradigm in which we can understand not only what is going on, but what could happen, becomes, you know, it shifts in colors, right? And so to understand Palestine and to understand the struggle for Palestinian freedom, we need to first look at what the very basic pillars of Zionism imply. And from this sense, the first to look at is how can you allocate land and resources to one ethno-religious category over anything else. And it's very important to also remember that, you know, the Zionist movement is a settler colonial movement. We're talking about a population that was imported to the indigenous land of Palestine. It's an amalgamation of different races, different colors, different ethnicities, broadly under the category of Jewishness, right? And so perhaps some of you are familiar with this, but it's important to note when we talk about apartheid, it's framing Israel as the hegemon, as the dominant military power between the river and the sea. And it's looking at the practices of the government in this case and how it is subjugating the non-Jewish population to its oppressive practices. And when I say non-Jewish, this is actually the term that is used by the state of Israel to describe anything else that is not Jewish, right? Which is already like a glimpse at the projection of inferiority towards other populations. Now, if it needs to be mentioned, in 1947 until 1949, Israel ethnically cleansed more than 800,000 Palestinians and illegally set up a state based on the United Nations resolutions, meanwhile taking, you know, not giving any consideration to the creation of Palestinian state, which is, you know, this origins of Palestinian statehood. Since then, it has employed a myriad of different practices to subjugate all of the different populations in Palestine. And so to fragment and to break any attempt at a unified Palestinian liberation project. And so when you began to ask me about where I'm from, it's usually a lesser known fact to many people that there are almost 2 million Palestinians that live inside of the state of Israel, right? And we are used as a token card to supplement this idea of a democracy, right? That we have a diversity in population. It's not only Jewish. Sorry. And this population is usually disregarded from the Palestinian struggle. So in 1949, when the Rhodes Agreement was signed, which is where the armistice lines were drawn between Jordan, Egypt, Syria, and Lebanon, almost 240,000 indigenous Palestinians were left in what is today considered Israel. And the practices that consolidated their existence were based on two major pillars. The first is land and resources, and the other is civil rights, political rights. And so Israel does not have a constitution. It has a Declaration of Independence, which makes it very clear that the ethnic, the nature of rights stems from the collective character of Jewishness, right? So that all of the policies that are made, all of the laws that are made, are created in such a way that favor the collective character of the state, and identifies everything else as an individual. So as a Palestinian inside 48, there's 2 million of us. We cannot guarantee to ourselves the same standing because we're not considered a collective. So in 1948, there was 93% of the land of Palestine was privately owned. And by November 1949, Israel had confiscated more than 1.3 million dunams in the Palestinian, in what is today called Israel. And it encapsulated and it encamped. You know, we look at the refugee camps and you know, we see the same similarities in 48, right? So the idea was to first compile Palestinians in such a way by stripping them away from the land.
Več kot 50% Palestincev živi pod mejo tveganja revščine in takšni so bili vsaj podatki pred zadnjim konfliktom, preden je 7. oktobra 2023 vse skupaj situacija torej v Palestini in Zahodnem bregu še eskalirala. Le kako bi bilo to torej nekaj nenavadnega pravzaprav, ko pa gre pravzaprav 53% bruto domačega proizvoda države Izrael za varnost oziroma je namenjena oboroževanju. No, manj kot odstotek bruto družbenega proizvoda dajo za kulturo, okoli 5% pa za izobraževanje. In nedavno so pravzaprav v Izraelu sprejeli tudi nov zakon, da morajo biti vsi palestinski učitelji preverjeni strani izraelske obveščevalne agencije. Učitelji. Nasrallah pravi, da kar 93% Izraelcev trenutno hoče, da Izraelci z genocidom nadaljujejo in da protesti, ki smo jih lahko videli v državi Izrael preko medijev, niso bili nič drugega kot združevanje ljudi pod sloganom "Vrnite nam talce". Ni jim bilo mar za vse tiste, ki so v konfliktu umrli. No, vse ostalo ni bilo pomembno, tako kot ni pomembno, da več kot polovica palestinskega ljudstva nima političnega zagovornika in je razseljena po vsem svetu.
For Israel to exist as it does, it had to employ all instruments and tools at its disposal to break the other, right? And to create a fragmentation of what a Palestinian is. And through its use of force, it's able to do that on multiple levels, right? And most notable of those is how you fragment and you create micro struggles for an entire Palestinian population. And when we talk about apartheid, it's important to understand that it is a cohesive and a cohesive, comprehensive system that judges or rules the lives of the 7 million Palestinians that exists by creating different legal standings and different control of movement and so on. And so the most blatant or the one that is most evident to the world is the Palestinians in the West Bank. And in the West Bank, we're talking about a population of almost 3 million Palestinians that are stateless with no citizenship. Palestinians that have restricted, extreme restrictions on movement, that have no control over their resources, that are surrounded by an apartheid wall, which is the longest and largest in the world, and they constantly face, this systematic dispossession of land and house demolitions. Meanwhile, trying to because we talked about this the other time, about this concept of statehood, creating a mirage for the Palestinian political reality to be that of let's go after creating a state. Meanwhile, taking away all the resources in terms of land and so on. But I think yes, let me talk a little bit about Palestinians in 48. Perhaps that's something that that might help explain what apartheid looks like internally. So between 1949 and 1966, the first Palestinians that were under occupation were actually the Palestinians that today have Israeli citizenship. And the way to do so was an attack on the very psyche of the Palestinian population in 48. And the attack on the psyche means, how do you break down a community's dignity and a community's basic understanding of what liberation is and of what it means to live free. And the way they did that was create a survivalist mode in which the first step was to dispose us of our own lands and to take, so what traditionally was an agricultural society suddenly has fragmented its relationship to the land, which has been taken by the state of Israel, and keeping us in these enclosures in which food and calorie counts were kind of, it was counted, how much intake we had, and to create the subversive identity of a Palestinian in which to survive, you had to assimilate into Israeli society. But you could never assimilate into Israeli society because you're not Jewish. And it was in these defining years, in these 20 years, in which we saw the creation of a mutilated Palestinian identity that, today suffers incredibly from criminality and criminal culture and so on. And a nail in the coffin of our identity was actually the signing of the Oslo Accords in 1993. So today, on all legal...
Can you explain why?
So following the Palestinian Revolution, or the first Intifada, there was a lot of political, there was an attempt by the political parties at the time, which were actually in Lebanon and then in Tunis, to come back and lead somehow these talks, right? And Israel needed that. It needed a proxy organization that ran the affairs and tried to quell the resistance from occurring, because there was no, there was the Palestinian Liberation Organization, but it wasn't an institution that was on the ground in Palestine at the time. And so what the creation of what became known today as the Palestinian Authority was a group of archaic Palestinian leaders that signed basically agreements in which they recognized Israel's right to exist. Meanwhile, Israel recognized them as the leadership and did not recognize Palestine as a sovereign nation. And in all of these agreements, there was zero mention of the Palestinians in 48, automatically translating us into an internal Israeli domestic affair that is not part of the Palestinian establishment as such, similar to the refugees in the refugee camps across the world.
Se mogoče sprašujete, zakaj toliko prostora posvečamo tej temi v oddaji o filmu in audiovizualni umetnosti?
Allow me just to add one thing. Every action you take matters. Even if it's just sharing things, opening up your social media spaces for sharing Palestinian voices. Actions you take on the street matters. Attempts to pressure your government to make arms embargo matters. Everything you're doing, we cannot stop. And I think that's what I meant by don't be desensitized. Do not let these forces, these mega media corporations make you feel like your voice does not matter. It's because it does matter. And I keep saying this, so don't stop. And keep escalating, because they will keep escalating. And so we need you now more than ever. And trust me, back home, especially in Slovenia, there's a lot of love that is coming out, because you're one of the very few nations that has been bold and brave enough to say, you do not need to prove your humanity to us, and we support your struggle. So please, do not stop. We need your solidarity more than you think, and it's really affecting the course of things back home. And thank you so much for what you've been doing already.
Prihodnjič pa kaj več o fikciji, pa čeprav mogoče malo tudi o autofikciji. Če vam bo pa slučajno zmanjkalo stvarnosti, pa se oglasite v Slovenski kinoteki, kjer imajo trenutno v teku retrospektivo posvečeno Kiri Muratovi, ki je šla sovjetskim oblastem tako v nos, da so njene filme tudi cenzurirali. Kar pomeni, da nekaj zagotovo imajo. Toliko za danes iz dislociranega studia. Do prihodnjič pa torej lahko noč in srečno.